Shangri. Reading Buzz. The view was certainly not what he had expected. Nothing was visible but an opaque mist veiling an immense, sun-browned desolation. The plane, though descending rapidly, was still at a height unusual for ordinary flying. Long corrugated mountain ridges could be picked out, perhaps a mile or so closer than the cloudier smudge of the valleys. It was typical frontier scenery. Conway had never viewed it before from such an altitude. It was also, which struck him as odd, nowhere that he could imagine near Peshawar.
"I don't recognize this part of the world,"
he commented. Then more privately, for he did not wish to alarm the others, he added to Mallinson's ear,
"Looks as if you are right. The man's lost his way."
The plane was swooping down at a tremendous speed, and as it did so, the air grew hotter. The scorched earth below was like an oven, with the door suddenly opened. One mountain top after another lifted itself above the horizon in craggy silhouette. Now the flight was along a curving valley, the base of which was strewn with rocks and the debris of dried-up watercourses. The plane bumped and tossed in air pockets as uncomfortably as a rowboat in a swell. All 4 passengers had to hold onto their seats.
"Looks like he wants to land,"
shouted the American hoarsely.
"He can't,"
Mallinson retorted. But the pilot did land. A small cleared space opened by the side of a gully, and with considerable skill the machine was jolted and heaved to a standstill. What happened after that, however, was more puzzling and less reassuring. A swarm of bearded and turbaned tribesmen came forward from all directions, surrounding the machine and effectively preventing anyone from getting out of it, except the pilot. After a further parley, the pilot climbed back into the cockpit. A Pathan clumsily swung the propeller and the flight was resumed. The takeoff, in that confined space and with the extra gasoline load, was even more skillful than the landing. The plane rose high into the hazy vapors, then turned east, as if setting a course. It was mid-afternoon. As the cooler air refreshed them, the passengers could hardly believe that it had really happened. It was an outrage to which none could recall any parallel or suggest any precedent. It would have been incredible indeed had they not been victims of it themselves. Mallinson then developed a theory which, in the absence of any other, they found easiest to accept. They were being kidnapped for ransom. There was a pane of glass, about 6 inches square, made to slide open, through which the pilot, by turning his head and stooping slightly, could communicate with his passengers. Conway tapped on this with his knuckles. The response was almost comical as he had expected. The glass panel slid sideways and the barrel of a revolver obtruded. Not a word, just that. Conway retreated without arguing the point, and the panel slid back again. Suddenly, they were all wakened by a lurch of the machine. Conway's head struck the window, dazing him for the moment. A returning lurch sent him floundering between the 2 tiers of seats. It was much colder. The first thing he did, automatically, was to glance at his watch. It showed 1:30. He must have been asleep for some time. His ears were full of a loud, flapping sound, which he took to be imaginary until he realized that the engine had been shut off and the plane was rushing against a gale. Then he stared through the window and could see the earth quite close, vague and snail-grey, scampering underneath.
"He's going to land!"
Mallinson shouted, and Barnard, who had also been flung out of his seat, responded with a saturnine,
"If he's lucky."
Presently, the plane touched the ground. But it was a bad landing this time. Mallinson groaned as he clutched at his seat during the 10 seconds of crashing and swaying. Something was heard to strain and snap, and one of the tires exploded.
"That's done it!"
He added in tones of anguished pessimism.
A broken tail skid. We'll have to stay where we are now. That's certain.
A moment later, chilled and shivering, they were all aware that this was so. The moon looked to have disappeared behind clouds, and starlight illumined a tremendous emptiness heaving with wind. Without thought or knowledge, one could have guessed that this bleak world was mountain high, and that the mountains rising from it were mountains on top of mountains. A range of them gleamed on a far horizon like a row of dog teeth. Mallinson, feverishly active, was already making for the cockpit.
I'm not scared of the fellow on land, whoever he is,
he cried.
I'm going to tackle him right away.
Conway sprang after him. After a few seconds, however, the youth dropped down again, gripping his arm and muttering in a hoarse, sobered staccato.
I say, Conway, it's queer. I think the fellow's ill or dead or something. I can't get a word out of him. I took his revolver at any rate.
As the air grew warmer, the others wakened, and he suggested carrying the pilot into the open, where the sharp, dry air and the sunlight might help to revive him. This was done, and eventually the man opened his eyes and began to speak convulsively. After some time, the man became weaker, talked with increasing difficulty, and finally died. That was about mid-morning. Conway then turned to his companions.
I'm sorry to say he told me very little. I mean, compared with what we should like to know. Merely that we are in Tibet, which is obvious. He didn't give any coherent account of why he had brought us here, but he seemed to know the locality. He spoke a kind of Chinese that I don't understand very well, but I think he said something about a lamasery near here, along the valley, I gathered, where we could get food and shelter. Shangri-La, he called it. La is Tibetan for mountain pass. He was most emphatic that we should go there. Very well then, we'll be off to Shangri-La. Wherever and whatever it is, we'll try it. But let's hope it's not halfway up that mountain.
The remark served to fix their glances on the glittering cone towards which the valley pointed. And then their gaze turned to a stare, for they could see, far away and approaching them down the slope, the figures of men. "Providence," they whispered. As the figures moved down the valley, they revealed themselves to be a party of a dozen or more, carrying with them a hooded chair. In this, a little later, could be discerned a person robed in blue. Much to their surprise, the robed figure stepped from the chair, came forward with dignified deliberation, and held out his hand. Conway responded and observed an old or elderly Chinese, grey-haired, clean-shaven, and rather pallidly decorative in a silk-embroidered gown. Then, in precise and perhaps too accurate English, he said,
I am from the lamasery of Shangri-La.